We didn't reach the midpoint of the column until late in the day. There the convoy had stopped, or so it appeared, dead in its tracks. The 8th Division CG Major General Dolman was there with his chopper. He and S3 Sapenter joined Colonel Couch, who was with us to discuss the problem. Apparently the military gas tankers that were supposed to refuel us on the move had failed to arrive, and the task force was now vehicle by vehicle topping off at a lone European Exchange Service EES gas station on the other side of the road. It was a snafu of the First Order road guards had had to stop all southbound traffic, while the entire convoy exited the Autobahn, filled up their tanks and looped back across the centre grass strip to continue the northbound tree. We found out later that tankers had been on the move, but some unthinking logistician from Division's G4 shop had sent them not from Bremerhaven, a logical choice, in that they would have met the head of the column with time to spare, but from south of Mannheim, and after the convoy had moved out. How anyone could have expected those huge mothers to catch up with much less double the moving column to give us. The juice was beyond nearly everyone's comprehension. Meanwhile, Coker and I were getting anxious. We wanted to join our companies. Dark was falling. The bottleneck at the EES station involved. Other units, companies D and B, were long past it, so we persuaded General Dolan to let us borrow his chopper and flew off in the failing light. The guys greeted me at Brunswick Airfield, where the task force would bivouac that night, with welcome smiles, and even more welcome SE Rations S, who'd been acting co in my absence, filled me in on how things had gone since the alert. The company leaders officer and NCO had done well and handled the emergency like pros. I finally found out what had prompted our mission. After years of threats, Kusoff had finally decided to act on his greatest problem with Berlin. Since the end of World War II, East German residents had been pouring from the red zone in flood proportions. The last decade alone averaged well over 200,000 per year, with the majority choosing the easy way out Berlin, where freedom was just a few unguarded paces beyond the Brandenburg Gate. Such an obvious show of voting with one's feet was a huge continuing embarrassment for the Kremlin and the puppet government of East Germany. So much for the utopia of the communist cyst system. So Kusoff had decided to stop it once and for all, and while Kennedy and company planned for contingencies like another blockade of access roads into Berlin, Kusoff and his gang pulled the plug from the other side overnight. The legally divided city became physically divided as well, with barbed wire and roadblocks strung along the entire 193-mile east-west Berlin border, guarded 24 hours a day by East German and Soviet soldiers. This interim barrier was the beginning of the Berlin Wall, and early the next morning we'd slowly make our way through the access corridor on East German soil to see it for ourselves at the airfield. That night the battle group was to the man professional. Few commanders or anyone else got much sleep, not only because of the amount that had to be done in the way of briefings and organization, but through sheer excitement we were sorely under strength. The division staff had arbitrarily decided that anyone with less than 30 days left on his tour was excused from the mission, but that didn't concern me as much as the rumour that we would not be going into Berlin with our trusty old Mies instead went the word. At this 11th hour, all the men were going to be issued brand new M14 as a failed suicidal mission. No one can say they weren't armed with the latest and greatest, maybe the powers that be remembered. Kuster, who declined the offer that his 7th cave be equipped with the new Gatling gun to take on the Indians at Little Bighorn, confident that the Red Men wouldn't stand and fight, and wanted to be sure we had all the firepower we'd ever need. The only problem was that much of the battle. Group had never fired the M14. Some probably hadn't even seen one. My guys, who at least knew how to handle and fire the weapon, wouldn't be at any real advantage, because factory-fresh M14S had no zero, and behind a weapon with no zero is a trooper. Even an experienced trooper with no confidence. It didn't seem the smartest way to go into a potential World War III situation, and I was not the only one who breathed a sigh of relief when the Helmstedt changeover did not come to pass. Every man in the battle group would be clean-shaven and perfectly polished from helmet to boots. "I want you not only to be the best soldiers," he said, "but also look the damned best JS's particular measuring stick of soldierly appearance. And even more important, a barometer of unit discipline was the steel pot's CH strap fastened precisely over the point of it, a man's chin at 0400 Sunday morning, when he took a final look at his battle group. The good colonel saw 1,500 walking recruitment posters in his very own image. JNS was in the lead vehicle when we approached the first Soviet checkpoint. The crossing was without incident, and we began the 100-odd-mile journey through Red territory the day before Colonel Couch had seen a Russian general and a few officers hurrying along the Autobahn in a sedan toward Berlin, as if trying to find out what we were all about now. In every tree line, on every hill and every bridge, there was a Soviet or East German unit tracking us with the main guns of their tanks. All told, 110,000 East German soldiers and 20 Soviet divisions surrounded Berlin that morning. Suffice to say, it was a very scary ride. We were the vanguards not just in name, but in fact, and sitting ducks if even one round was fired. JS's last stand, thought. Remembering the colonel's remark early that morning, we'll end up like Custer if those goddamn Ruskies take us on. But we'll take a goodly number of the sons of guns with us when we go. I worried about my marginal soldiers. What if they panicked and opened fire themselves? Tim Grattan called and asked if he should set up mortars. If we got hit, no, just fight as infantry, I said as nonchalantly as I could, knowing full well it would be over as soon as it began. Infantry and trucks was no match for Wall 2. All Soviet tanks, the tension was almost unbearable. Waiting for an explosion, a shot or something that would start the shooting match. Then I heard a roar coming directly toward us from the road up ahead. At first I thought it was a tank. The closer it got, I realized it was a twin-engine jet bomber flying about 60 feet off the ground. As it got closer, I saw its bomb bay doors were open, too low to bomb us. I thought he'll blow himself out of the sky. But then, my God, he's going to strafe the column. How no one panicked in the face of this thing. Each of our vehicles had an air guard with an M60 or 50 cal MG, could only be attributed to the great training of the 18th or just plain old fatalism acquired of necessity. Like Dick Coker's first thought when he saw the Soviet bomber, well, they're going to take us out right here. But whatever the reason, not one shot was fired. And as the plane swooped over the convoy, we could see it was just a Soviet recon on aircraft, taking photographs, bastards, fine pictures. Could have been taken from 1,000 times the altitude, but the Reds just couldn't resist one truly provocative act. But then we reached West Berlin, and the enemy stepped aside. Swords remained snugged in scabbards. There was no blood, but the castle was under siege no longer we, the vanguards. 1,500 white knights and trucks and jeeps had saved the day. The people were overjoyed as far as the eye could see, were smiling, tearful faces estimated later at 300,000 strong. Colonel Johns's jeep was immediately swarmed with Berliners throwing flowers and kisses. Their cheers were deafening. I had to strain to hear the colonel's voice on the radio. "Hack, we're going to have a little march through the city. Now you're leading. Now want you to stand up on your seat and hold on to that windshield wave and smile all? You like pretend you're Caesar going into Rome. You hear yes sir with that JNS pulled up at a reviewing stand, where stood Vice President Johnson, along with West Berlin Mayor Willy Brandt, and the high-ranking muckamuck of the Berlin Command Major General Albert Watson, S.U.S. Commandant, and Brigadier General Frederick Harrell, C.G. When Johnson, who had flown in for the occasion, had arrived earlier that morning, he'd received the same hero's welcome as we were getting now, and excited the crowd in the best cowboy in Indian tradition, by hitching up his trousers as he got out of his car, a Texas symbol of determination. Stars and Stripes reported. Meanwhile, I stood up in my jeep as directed, and led the parade through the cheering crowds. So young, I heard again and again. I guess they thought I was the so young colonel, since I was in the lead vehicle, and I knew I had to be on my best behaviour. It wasn't easy. The entire convoy was in Tim Grattan's words up to its armpits and flowers thrown by the crowd, but we were also being bombarded with ping-pong balls and wads of paper, why I didn't know, till finally one caught one of the balls printed neatly on. It was "My name is Polly," or Heidi, or Gertrude, and a telephone number. Well, it's no mean feat to remain a composed and dignified liberating hero and collect flying ping-pong balls at the same time. But I gave it my best try. By the time we got to Andrews Barracks, Colonel Johns and the VIPs had already arrived. We unloaded stashed ping-pong balls in pockets and stood tall in formation after the Vice President gave his welcoming address. Colonel JNS was asked to speak. Undoubtedly, everyone expected a corny old soldier talk, not knowing John spoke 5 languages when he opened his mouth and poured out a beautiful speech in fluent German jaws bongs dropped open across the podium. Talk about showmanship. That cool Hbray one thought he's probably been writing the thing since we left Helmstead. We'd arrived DE'd intact, and besides the petrol fiasco without a single hitch over the 435 M-Trek, not one of our 491 vehicles had broken down to the credit of the battle group motor officer Captain Weaver, an army aviator doing his ground duty hitch, and not one soldier had screwed up to the credit of Colonel Johns. Now everyone just needed a little sleep. We weren't the only ones, though. Later, I heard that 4,000 miles away, cadets at VMI, having heard their old command was leading the Berlin task force, had posted maps and tracked our route full-time for the last 2 days a week. Later, a photograph taken of Colonel JNS at this tired time was published as a full page in Life magazine. In it, he looked exhausted and pensive, though still every inch a soldier. Some weeks later, a Life reader wrote in to remark that the colonel bore an uncanny resemblance to the subject of a Rembrandt painting called The Man with the Golden Helmet. We all thought this was kind of spooky, because having sked around to find a copy of the Rembrandt ourselves, it was absolutely true. Johns designated D Company as the battle group's reaction force. As such, we moved over to Tempelhof Air Force Base TFB the whole way across town from the rest of the battle group, which suited me just fine, and about 1,600 yards from the Friedrichstrasse border crossing, also known as Checkpoint Charlie. This heavily guarded crossing was the only access left between the two Berlin, augmented by a platoon of M48 tanks and 9 armoured personnel carriers APCs. We were to be on a 5-minute alert, sleeping in full gear, with boots on ammo and load-bearing. Equipment stacked, guarded and ready until tensions eased in this showdown. TAFB had fine facilities. We were given a huge unused hangar, perfect for barracks mess, and offices with plenty of room left over for a complete indoor training ground. But before we all had a chance to move in, the base, Commander and Air Force Colonel arrived to welcome us to his command and tell me he'd arranged for the D Company officers to stay at the USAF Hotel, the Columbia House nearby as well. A new chauffeur-driven Mercedes-Benz was mine simply. Our longevity, to quote Tim Grattan, would have been about 5 minutes. The Voss sometimes used mirrors to reflect sunlight into our cameras and binoculars, a weird weapon that was right out of the Bible, where shields were used to blind the enemy. They also used water cannons, but not necessarily with water. 118th Patrol got hit with a load of night soil, aka human waste. Colonel Couch's retaliative suggestion for that was to zap them with atom sight grenades, which produced a host of unpleasant, though temporary effects, including severe nausea. The counter-effort worked, and the German night soil assaults ceased once and for all. Meanwhile, letters of commendation praising our move to Berlin were pouring in from President Kennedy, on down the Berliners, calling us liberators, and saviours showered any man wearing the 8th Div patch and the 18th green and white foray with all the love and affection in their hearts. The 6th Infantry got surlier and surlier over all the attention we were receiving. Inevitably, this led to some tremendous fights in clubs and bars around town. The 6th guys would grab one of our men by his fireman's rope, the 4er for leverage take a swing, and it was on Colonel JNS counselled the battle group to use restraint, personally shared the nightly duty with Colonel Couch and other field-grade officers of roaming around the trouble spots and making his presence known, and even talked to the 6th's Kosos to put an end to it. When nothing helped, he gave permission for his boys to let fly unbeknownst to the friendly enemy. A couple of guys in the 18th were karate black belts, and before Berlin unarmed combat had been part of the training schedule. So when our boys let loose, they were like a buzzsaw, running amok through the 6th in ranks soon after the 2 permanent party battle group Kosos got with Colonel Johns to find a better solution, and much of the violence stopped happily. Company D played little part in all this mayhem. The worst of it sprang from the fact that the 18th was collocating with the other battle groups and stealing all their girls over at Temple Hof. Our only competition were the flyboys, and because the little Frylines who milled around the base were equally enamoured with them. There was hardly any friction at all. In truth, there shouldn't have been any. To begin with, the ratio of girls to guys in Berlin was 7-1. It was a soldier's paradise. I knew we were onto something when I saw the ugliest guy in my company, a short, dumpy albino kind of guy with scars and boils all over his face, strolling through Temple Hof like Valentine Eno with a Prussian beauty on each arm. Guys like Edet and Tim Grattan were as straight as the arrow on their 8th div patches, but the rest of D Company's officers were bachelors, and they took full advantage of it. The players and stayers among the married officers in the 18th came to Temple Hof for their dalliances far from the eyes of JNS and the rest of the staff. As for myself, Berlin was simply a belated conclusion to the journey I'd set out on with Al Huit 15 years before. This is the army of occupation in Germany. Al, you've got to join up, I'd say to myself from time to time, wishing my dear old friend were with me to help cash in on all the ping-pong balls. It didn't take long for word to get back to the wives in Mannheim that the married liberators were taking too many liberties of their own. JNS intervened on behalf of the ladies, organising RNRs for them with their husbands in Berlin, the unstated rule being that the Temple Hof Officers' Club was off-limits, or letting each of us go home for a few days. One of the married NCOs in my unit got his chance to go home the morning after his Berlin girlfriend planted a wicked hickey on his neck. When he came to me for advice, the only thing I could think to do was call in the medic for some emergency surgery. The doc took a scalpel to the angry red blotch, made a first-class wound out of the thing, ripped it on barbed wire, the guy could say bravely, and bandaged it up. Apparently the ruse worked, because the guy came back still married, and that was no mean feat, and that the divorce rate within the battle group skyrocketed during our stay in Berlin, as did marriages between troopers and West Berlin girls. One of the most successful American ladies' men in Berlin was a brilliant young Army aviator captain named Dale Lur. 24 years old, short solid, and built like a bull Lur, would have been among the top 3 on my list of animals I have known. I met him through Jerry Hillman, who'd been one of his flight school classmates, and we became good buddies despite the fact that even by my standards, Dale was an absolute wild man. He'd stand in the officers' club sipping a martini when he was through. He'd eat the glass, just nonchalantly stand there and crunch it down to sand. It was a good trick that must have taken some time to master in the interests of showmanship. I tried at once only to cut all hell out of my lips and tongue, but since all my boys were there, I had to keep on chewing and pretend it was perfectly natural for me to be slugging down the booze with blood gushing out of my mouth. Dale L. Cleric's unparalleled success with the Frylines was most likely the result of his imagination and his extraordinary charm. He'd fly his chopper over the Berlin lakeside beaches, for example, throwing out leaflets that read, "The handsome young man flying this helicopter is Captain Dale Lear. If you would like to meet him in person, ring him with, of course, his phone number, and the best time to call these things would flutter en masse onto the tanned belly of the West Berlin sunbathers." And the results were mind-boggling once I went back to his apartment with him, only to find a line of girls waiting patiently at his door, all of them ready to live the day as if it would be their last. The prevailing philosophy among most West Berliners. At this time Dale didn't know a single one, but with both good judgment and generosity allowed a few to introduce themselves to me. Sadly, he had to abandon that particular airborne promotion scheme when one of his Leaf landed on the lap of one of the Chief of Staff's Berlin command dependents. She took it home to her daddy, who failed to see the humour of it as part of the Berlin Aviation Detachment, whose basic purpose was to hide VIPs along the Berlin Wall. L. Claire was permanent party at Tempelhof, and responsible for all the helicopters there. One afternoon, he did a favour for an elderly Berlin-based civilian photographer, letting the guy take a bird's eye look at the wall. Berlin reporters were not authorised on US Army aircraft, but by any stroke of good luck, Dale should have gotten away with it. He didn't. As the chopper tooled around in the air, it was fired upon a single projectile crashing through the bubble of the aircraft. Had the flight been authorised, This incident could have been yet another serious east-west flasho. Since it wasn't, the warrant officer pilot reported nothing and hightailed it back to Tempelhof immediately upon Dale's investigation. The damage had come not from a bullet, but a bolt which some East German must have sent up with a slingshot. Dale got a new bubble for the chopper, swore everyone to secrecy, and that was the end of it. A week later, the unauthorized flight became an international incident. The warrant officer let the proverbial cat out of the bag, and who did what to whom, and why the hell was that chopper up there in the first place, were just the preliminary queries in an investigation that involved everyone from Dale Co. up to the highest levels in Europe, if not to the president himself. It didn't do wonders for L. Claire's career. He received an Article 15 non-judicial punishment, and to my great disappointment was removed from the Berlin command. The Bolt incident was only one of a number of potential flashpoints in the early days of life in the physically divided city. Another was TV personality Jack Parr's visit in this episode. 80 US soldiers in full battle gear plus 7 US jeeps armed with machine guns and recoilless rifles came rushing unprovoked up to. Checkpoint Charlie, as cameras rolled, they were joined by 7 officers, and while the Vost looked on anxiously from the other side, Parr began his razzle-dazzle report on the ground with the troops. The public information officer of the Berlin command was relieved by Theatre C.G. Clark. In the wake of this cops and robbers affair, which the info officer had organised, and which the Pentagon later called 4 disgraceful episode, and the battle group Co. who provided the troopers was admonished. All of us played hard in Berlin, but the 18th worked damn hard too. The uni-wide issue of M4S took place only days after we arrived. We turned in our M1 simultaneously, so despite the Helmstedt reprieve, we still found ourselves with un-zero weapons in what was considered a combat zone. We got priority on the lighted KD ranges and zeroed them at night. I hadn't zero-ed a weapon at night since Camp Drake in Tokyo the night before I shipped to Korea for the first time. Then it had been cold, and I remembered how awkward it was to zero my M1 wearing the gloves I'd been issued, of course. Now it was late summer in Berlin, with warm, balmy nights. So there wasn't really much to the exercise, except a nice bit of nostalgia after the M14 change over serious training began. And for all our fire and manoeuvre field troops, and most of the officers as well, it was a whole new ballgame: riot control, fixed bayonets, skirmish lines, bullhorns, tear gas, and feet stomping on cue. Was pretty boring, particularly since the only potential riots in West Berlin were between the US units stationed there. But combat in cities. The next block of instruction was great. The Berlin command had built a complete mock city for this training. I'd learned much of the stuff as a private in Italy, fighting door todo using grappling hooks to climb up buildings, employing snipers and grenades in a city environment. But us quickly learned that the view of the one being employed is dramatically different than that of the one doing the employing. So as a company commander, I got a hell of a lot out of the instruction. The 6th Infantry were experts in both city fighting and riot control. Despite their palace guard flabbiness, they proved able teachers still to prevent their becoming too cocky. A while later, we fought them in a tactical field exercise in Berlin's Grunwald forest, and whipped their asses in the process, rekindling their outrage at our very presence in their city. There were few good training areas around the airbase for field exercises, but we made do in direct contrast to the Manhattan Beach community. The Berliners, who were right into anything military, loved watching us train, and we put on a pretty impressive show with Shit singing a mean version of When the Saints Go Marching In during our runs, and the company chiming in on each line at full voice without miss a step. PT was designed as much for fun as to work up a good sweat. Sometimes I'd challenge the guys to beat me in push-ups, and we'd do hundreds, until none but the studs were left. It was the same with the runs. On one occasion, Coy gave the order to go for broke, and while most of the group fell out at 10 or 12 miles, the studs kept moving. In the end, the only ones left were Adderley Grattan and S., the jock's me, and that hardcore mother of them all, Sergeant Sweeney. We continued night training in a limited way. One of the first exercises was a company night attack across the runways at Tempelhof. Consideration for all elements of the manoeuvre was taken into account, or so we thought, until simultaneously, with a red star cluster shooting into the sky, signalling the commencement of the attack, and my 200 men dashing across the airstrip firing blanks, a commercial jet came roaring into Temple Hof on its final approach. The pilot thought the airport was under attack, and he pulled out all stops and zoomed off to abort the landing. Naturally, a lot of people, not least of them the pilot, were a bit upset about infantry playing cops and robbers on the online runway, and the next morning Tim Grattan, who was the training officer, was summoned before the TFB command. I was scared to death, he reported when he returned, but when I saw the infantry CIB on this Air Force guy chest, I knew we weren't going to be too far up creek. He was right. We had our wrists slapped, and thereafter coordinated our night manoeuvres a little better, with the airbase authorities failing. That I'd send Big Ed Fat over after the fact to smooth things out again. Thank God it only lasted 3 months. Ed would later say, I used to think it was your way of keeping my weight down. I lost a few pounds off my backside every time I made a call. The comparative freedom D Company had in Berlin resulted from time to time in little lapses in discipline, even among the more solid young soldiers in my command. One of these guys was an E4 I'll call Jack Fry, who was reported AWOL early one morning. It was a pretty straightforward case. The rumour was he'd fallen in love and was shacked up in the British sector of the city. The easiest course of action was simply to wait, and when he returned, court-martial him, but I didn't want to do that. As a kid, I'd come in laid off a pass a few times. The only difference between Fry and me was never got caught. The boy, he was only 19, was not a screw-up. In fact, he was a damn good soldier with a lot of potential, and my gut feeling told me not to use him as a horrible example. So instead, I authorized a 3-day pass, had someone forge Fry's signature on the sign-out roster, and asked his own platoon to go out looking for him that evening. Of course, if he'd been found floating face down in the river overnight and was now lying in a morgue somewhere. It'd be kind of difficult to explain how he managed to sign himself out, but I kind of felt the odds were on our side when Fry strolled in. Later that day, he was brought to my office. This won't go on your record, Fry. I told him I could bust you, but I've decided to turn you over to Sergeant Sweeney instead. He'll determine what your punishment will be. But let me tell you something, young soldier. I just laid it on the line for you. You owe me one. You've got the potential, so don't screw it up. The boy agreed to smarten up his act, and I never had any trouble with him again. He was always a bit of a wise guy, but that was probably another reason why I liked him soon after this incident. And the funny thing about it was, little did I know when I saved Jack Fry's ass that a decade later he'd save mine. I decided to make acting sergeants out of a number of my E4S until we got some E5 allocations in the battle group. Another of Chief of Staff Taylor's black shoe innovations had been to abolish the rank of corporal and replace it with the specialist system. A stupid move in that corporal historically was and should have remained the first rung on the NCO leadership ladder. There were about 8 guys due for promotion, gave it to all of them, save Fry. He was fully qualified, but I wasn't going to reward a guy who'd just been laid off a pass at the weekly inspection just hours after the promotions were announced. Fry stood at a stone-faced attention, Fry, I said, as I inspected his weapon. I was thinking about promoting you to acting sergeant too, but I really think you're too young. Well, if I understand it correctly, sir, the E4 rejoined immediately. You were a sergeant when you were 16, he was off by a couple of years, but he got to me. I guess I was a softer touch than I'd thought. As soon as the inspection was over, I had the first sergeant cut Fry a promotion order too. I always tried to give guys the benefit of the doubt. Generally, I worked on the baseball principle, 3 strikes, you're out, but now and then my hair-trigger temper got the better of me. What followed then was like a period of temporary insanity, though the rage itself was justified, and at times like these I could do absolutely anything on the battlefield. This fury was a gift, at other times a definite liability. When, for example, during a general alert, our attached truckmaster staggered in late, which was very serious in itself, and drunk, which was inexcusable. If the whole company hadn't been assembled there, I probably would have pistol-whipped him to a bloody pulp. Only some unconscious survival mechanism stopped me instead. I stood the truck sergeant at attention in the middle of our hangar, whipped out my loaded .45 and thumped it on his chest, while I chewed his sorry ass to shreds. Grattan told me later the guy wanted to press for a court-martial until Sweeney and a number of other non-coms counselled him that it would be a pretty dumb thing to do. The guy was lucky to have people like that around. My own counsellor was Tim Grattan himself, who, when I was about to go half or fully crazed over a trooper or a policy, would just shake his head and with a grin declare, "Sir, I think you're pissing in the wind," and it was so much better to leave the dirty work to Sweeney anyway. Not that I couldn't have done it as well, but to my old army brain it was more appropriate for an NCO to shape people up when a guy missed Revit one morning simply because he drunk too much the night before. Sweeney tasked Fry and another sergeant to get him out of the sack and bring him to the mess hall. Being the good first sergeant, Fry explained later, Sweeney wanted the trooper to eat before he disciplined him any. So he put the guy in line. The kid took a tray, put scrambled eggs right on it instead of on a plate, and dumped a cup of coffee over the eggs. Then he went over to sit down at a table. Needless to say, this made the first sergeant awfully mad. So JJ braced him facing against the wall and told the kid to stand there and eat. The kid said something smart to him, and JJ told him to turn around. He did. So now the guy was standing there holding the tray, and JJ just hauled off and hit the tray from the bottom right up into the kid's face. Scrambled eggs and everything went flying all over the place, and all the German KPS went running for cover. Then the first sergeant had me and the other sergeant take the kid outside, where we took turns running him until about 2 or 3 hours later, when he literally dropped to the ground and we had to haul him back over to the barracks. The net result of SWNCO discipline was not a demand for a court-martial by an AG grieved screw-up. Instead, the kid did a 180 degrees turnaround, like Private Russell, in the 77th. He became a damn good soldier. And since that was what being in the army was all about, the moral of the story is that experienced hard-ass NCOs like Sweeney are not by design brutal, unfeeling individuals. They do not break soldiers for the hell of it. They know what a trooper will need when the time comes, and if they break him at all, it's only to rebuild him again with a stronger, life-prolonging foundation to support him. The doc. "Hello, David, how are you?" he asked. "It's lovely to see you." I nodded but couldn't look at him, and, "How are Patty and the girls?" "They're fine, Harold, just fine. We'll give them all a big hug for me, will you?" Sure, with that I took the stand and testified against my friend the spy. 6 months later, Borger would be the first American ever to face the West German Supreme Court for espionage. Then he'd testify that his motives were pure, that he'd spied for East Germany solely to further the cause of Israel, believing there was a revival of anti-Semitism and militarism in West Germany, and that he'd meant no harm to the United States or West Germany themselves. There was no evidence at all to back up his claims. He was found guilty and was sentenced to 2.5 years. Where he went after that, I'd never know. I never saw him again. I left Patty, who had proved once again, just as she had at Fort Sill during the show cause investigation, to be the epitome of the solid, steadfast army wife, and headed back to Berlin, just a passover. Captain worried that my troops would find out their stud SE was a failure, that they'd see my disappointment and my heavy, heavy feet of clay. I worked overtime being cheerful, while in fact I went on a bender that lasted for days. I told no one save Dick Coker, who stood by during many a drunken night to provide whatever support he could. I found out only later that a number of my men knew the truth from the first day, but mercifully kept it to themselves. Meanwhile, Colonel John started pulling strings to find out what had happened. First, he called an old buddy, Colonel Beverly Rock Ridd, who was working with the Chief of Assignments for infantry officers from Red. Came the news that I'd not been passed over, which was a relief to pass over, and you're out of the service, but under a new system was deemed fully qualified but not selected. The reason Colonel Young's 9-year-old ER rendered after 40 days' observation of me when I was 21, which stated I was impetuous and immature. Colonel Johns was furious, always looking after his boys. He fired every cannon he could get his hands on, while Colonel Reed took the case before his boss, Brigadier General Reuben Tucker, a much-renowned World War II regimental commander with the 82nd Airborne JNS, turned to CG Bruce Clark. General Clark started pulling strings of his own, and when Tucker approved Colonel Reed's recommendation that my record go before a special board of study, it promised to be a pretty smooth road. In the meantime, I stopped bleeding, shook off the enormous blow to my pride, and finally got my arse wholeheartedly back to work, when Maxwell D. Taylor JFK's personally selected military representative of the president decided to visit Berlin, Colonel J's designated company dossed the airport honor guard under the new style of army leadership. This sort of thing would have been a nightmare under Johns's old army command style. It was a dream. No staff officers came prowling around for pre-inspections. JNS himself gave me the mission put on a show for him. Will you write by the book? And if you need anything, just holler. And I didn't see him until about 10 minutes before Taylor arrived 4 days later. "How are you doing, Hack?" He said. "Just fine, sir. Would you like to inspect the honor guard?" He glanced toward the 80 stud force side, called from the company. "No, they look good to me." Then he paused. "On the other hand, I'll tell you what, why don't I just put the boys through their paces, right, sir?" He strolled over to the honor guard. 8 on hut. He bellowed like a drill sergeant, "Present arms." The men quickly complied. "Order?" Arms. JNS grinned. "Stand easy, boys." "Well, that's fine," he said with his gentle drawl. "Throw me your rifle there, son. I mean throw it." The kitty was addressing hurled his M14 at the colonel. "Now, gentlemen," JNS continued, catching the weapon easily. "It's been a long time since I did this kind of thing. But when you're doing the drill, put a little extra snap into it with that." He whipped that weapon around as if it were a 2B cane, each movement with complete precision, as though he'd been doing it every day of his life. "See what I mean?" he asked offhandedly as he tossed the rifle back to the trooper. All the boys were working hard not to smile. Jay's had that effect on them. He was so obviously in love with his profession and his troops that just seeing him in action was an inspiration, and it seemed as if everyone admired him. A lot of times troopers would come to my office and ask to see him. "Oh, damn, I'd think what? Now can I help you?" "Sergeant?" I'd say, "No, sir, I want to see the colonel. It can be arranged, but I don't think it would hurt for you to tell me what's on your mind." "Yes, sir, my wife had a baby last night. Little boy, I want to tell the colonel we're naming him Glover Johns." This happened all the time, particularly among the guys in the outfit. JNS was just a stud and a charmer who knew soldiers and soldiering even better than his namesake's names, and it was that very thing, his total confidence as a leader of men, that gave us the room to breathe to fail, and to grow a screwed-up honor guard for Maxwell D. would have done little to advance John's career, but the colonel trusted me enough to know I wouldn't blow it, and of course I busted my ass. The honor guard stint went off without a hitch to make sure he was right. Trust, that magic word, was not dead after all, at least while commanders like John's were around. We left Berlin before Christmas, replaced by a 24th Division battle group out of southern Germany. There was no fanfare, just a cold, cold morning to remember the Cold War city by, as we retraced the route we'd taken some 3.5 months before the Soviets had dubbed the reinforced US presence in Berlin. Military hysteria, we'd ignored them and stayed on, as would the 24th, to remind them of our military strength and commitment to Berlin, while life in the west side of the divided city pretty well went back to business. As usual, the building of the wall had provoked one of the chilliest moments of the Cold War, but considering everything, it was just a political game. After all, our presence didn't stop the wall going up even 1 minute, and had there been a serious confrontation, our forces wouldn't have stood a chance. A fact just as obvious to the White House as to the Kremlin. The thing about the wall was that despite Cush's big offensive threats in the years preceding his decisive act in Berlin, the wall itself, as any soldier should know, was a defensive concern. It wasn't defensive in a strategic war. Making sense, it had not been built to prevent the West invading Soviet-controlled soil. Berlin had been like an hourglass, the people of East Germany flowing to the western sector relentlessly, like grains of sand. And no matter how much the Soviets narrowed the aperture, the people kept on coming every day. We were there. East Germans tried to escape, and the VPOs, besides the scores who made the M break themselves, tried to stop them. At least 2 were brutally slain, swimming the 50 yards between east and west across the Titu Canal. Shot in the back by East German soldiers, double strands of barbed wire along the canal bank had closed that escape route, but it didn't matter. The determined still found a way, and always would. The Berlin Wall was simply an exceptionally effective monument to the failure of the communist Neopal system. Koch had solved his problem, But at a very high price at the checkpoint coming out of Berlin, my unit was inspected by a Soviet captain. The Russians were mad people and truck counters. We'd gone through the same drill governed by provisions in the Potsdam Agreement on the way in, de-trucking, lining up in files and waiting for the OK to keep moving. Though I'd thought these inbound checks had been without incident when we reached Berlin, I'd heard one quite amazing story involving a member of one of my squads. The rule was that though the Reds could make us unload and reload any time they wanted, and though they could inspect the contents of our vehicles at will, they were not allowed to touch the vehicles themselves in any way. Apparently a Russian third lieutenant, too short to adequately inspect one of the trucks, had stood up on the tongue of the attached trailer to get a better view. One of our Spec 4s, an old World War II guy who'd been a master sergeant, but never seemed to be able to hold his rank, thanks to the 3-day binges he went on every time the Eagle, and who was sitting in the truck by the tailgate, had hauled off and butt-stroked the Soviet in the face with his M1 III. Lieutenant landed bloody and dazed at the feet of his boss, a colonel. Everyone in the truck had figured that this was it. Hello, World War III. Instead, the Russian colonel had jerked the boy to his feet and dragged him away behind a building where he chewed the lieutenant's ass to borscht at the top of his voice. What had interested me most about this episode was that despite the overall tension, despite the Soviet bombers too close for comfort, provocative overflight, and the VOU and Soviet guns tracking us the whole way up the East German corridor, that Russian colonel, the guy on the ground, had been in no hurry to start a big confrontation. Still, as I saluted the Red officer now on our way out, I just hoped our Spec 4 would not give an encore performance, sir. I said my unit is ready for inspection. The captain returned my salute. He was a small guy with high cheekbones, almond-shaped eyes, and thin, determined lips pursed tightly together. As we walked toward the company, I noticed he could not take his eyes off my pile cap. He was wearing one, too, of similar type. But the fur was almost blue. I thought maybe it was the paratrooper wings or captain tracks pinned to mine that had grabbed his attention, so I took the cap off and offered it to him. He put it on and gave his to me. He finished his counting, each of us wearing the other's hat, and told us we could go. Then he looked at me, and for the briefest instant he smiled, and in that moment there was no Cold War. We were simply the day-to-day custodians of someone else's suspicions and fears. We were just two soldiers trapped into hating each other by the roles our countries had ordered us to play. We traded hats again, and the 18th started the long trip home. It was uneventful. All things considered, except when one platoon of Captain Rosenstein's E Company, some got off the Autobahn and took a scenic drive through East Germany. Colonel Couch, who was travelling with Rosie's unit, decided to halt the column, and while the boys took advantage of this unscheduled comfort stop, a Soviet lieutenant colonel tasked to monitor the withdrawal pulled up on the scene. He laughed, related Couch, got on his radio and told the Russian command, "We'd stopped to wet XO." Charlie Rogers offered the guy an Irish coffee, which, according to Couch, he really put away. When Couch asked him about the missing platoon, the light colonel cheerfully said they'd taken the wrong turn and were going in the other direction even before Rogers. Poured a second shot of coffee, the Russian officer had agreed to take Rosenstein with him, and together they'd bring the missing element back to the main column. The stragglers, unharmed and intact, were ultimately rounded up on the road to Dresden. It was no big mystery who'd get the Fugawi Award that week, and put back on track, the Russian had been good to his work, and considering him the Soviet colonel who chewed out his third lieutenant and the Soviet captain who'd worn my hat, it kind of made you wonder what all the hating was about when a green West Point or Rock lieutenant joined D Company always had Sergeant Sweeney or another of my old Army NC sit in on my first conversation with him. "Glad to have you with us. I'd say looks as if you have a fine record from the academy, but let me tell you something now. I don't want to upset you or anything, but you don't know nothing about soldiersing. You see old Sweeney here?" I gestured to the sergeant sitting across the room. "When I was a little kid, Sweeney was a plon sergeant in Sicily dropped with the 82nd. Is that correct?" "Sweeney, yes, sir, and he fought that platoon from Sicily to Normandy, and all the way to the Elbe, where he met up with the Russians. Isn't that right, Sweeney?" "Yes, sir. Matter of fact, he's been an infantry platoon sergeant for how long? Old Man Sweeney's name is used here as an example, only as this great NCO was fielded first, now operating on a company, not a platoon level. 22 years, sir, 22 years now, when you're a full colonel lieutenant and you're sitting in the Pentagon with your feet up on a desk getting fat, and your kids are little or maybe even grown up and going to college. Old Sweeney will still be running a platoon somewhere, don't you think? So Sweeney, more than likely, sir, can't think of anything else I'd like to do. So, Lieutenant, I think it's fair to say he knows more about infantry than you will ever know. So what's going to happen here is Sween is going to be your teacher. He will command the platoon and you will follow his instructions. You are not commanding anything. Don't give orders and confuse things. Just do what he says when he's ready to let you command the platoon. He'll let you know. Do you understand by now? The new lieutenant's face would be ash and white, yes, sir. He'd say his perfect military bearing marred only by a meek and trembling voice. Okay, Sweeney, take him away. We're always shocked. Ian was a technique I used with Sweeney, or a guy just like him in every command I ever had, until the NCO Corps was bled dry. Becoming a competent infantryman is no overnight transformation. The toughest job in the US Army is that of a rifle platoon leader. This is the guy who is at the cutting edge of the whole war, yet historically the platoon has been led by the most inexperienced and thus the most incompetent guy. In the chain of command, even if a guy comes in with talent, it still takes 5 or 10 years of really hard work to get the knowledge and develop the skills to the point of second nature. General Patton is reported to have said that an officer needed 10 years of troop experience before he started to earn his pay, and some never did in the case of the new lieutenants in my company. The old seasoned NCOs always did the greenhorns with the respect. Do their rank look? Sir, this is how you do this, as they taught them all they knew. But at the same time, and as important as the teaching, the lieutenants developed an abiding respect for the role of NOCOS in a unit, and for the NCOs themselves. It was something they just weren't taught at the academy or through the ROC program. On the other hand, there were a lot of things not taught to the enlisted guys about the officer world, things that might have been kind of helpful to know, and one thing that long bothered me after my commissioning in 1951 was the zero preparation I'd had to make an easy adjustment. From EEM to officer rank in D Company, a number of soldiers wanted to go to OCS, since I was the one who made the recommendations. I figured the best thing to do was give these eager beavers a shot at command, and while I took the opportunity to assess their potential, they could get an idea of what being an officer was all about in the regular army. At this time, a squad leader generally had 12 or so years in the service for my program. I organized a provisional squad that one OCS hopeful at a time would run. We'd feed the guy the basics, and then we'd observe his leadership style in action if we thought he had what it took. He'd next become the company's training NCO in this role. He dealt directly with me, the rest of the company officers and the senior non-coms. This gave us the chance to find out what made the guy tick, and because I was right on top of training, there wasn't one detail I didn't want to know. It was pretty easy to determine how efficient and capable he was. The program was not authorized, but it worked quite well, and to my great pride, a number of men who'd been through it went on to Benning and became honor graduates in their OCS classes. Sergeant Hartman was one of these OCS hopefuls from all the facts on my desk. This heavily built but fit former Marine seemed to shoe in for the Benning assignment, but something about him always made me uneasy to start with. I didn't like him. To me, he was an apple polisher and an ass-kisser, and he approached soldiering like a kid playing war on the back lot. He'd done a competent job in the squad leadership phase of our program, though. And in fairness, I'd had to bring him in as my training NCO some months before. By the time we left Berlin, I'd had it with him more than once. I'd caught him in lies, meant to cover numerous training screw-ups I'd already noted. More than once I'd come back to my office to find him sitting behind my desk, wearing an officer's camouflage scarf and smoking a big long cigar with his skinhead haircut. He looked like a piss-weak Mussolini. Who the hell do you think you are? Hartman. I'd say John Wayne Hartman had proved himself super ambitious in itself. No crime, but with a power obsession that spelled nothing but trouble. I felt he was the kind of guy who, once he got in charge of troops, would initially abuse them and ultimately get them killed. So the day finally came when I told him he was officer material. "You can stay on as a sergeant or transfer out," I said, "but you're not going to OCS from my company." Hartman didn't take it very well. In fact, about 2 weeks later he went AWOL, and a few days after that his uniform was found neatly folded on the bank of the Rye River with a letter to Colonel JNS. Its message was pretty straightforward. Something like, "Dear Colonel Johns, I've committed suicide here in the river because Captain Hackworth is an unfair, no-good prick who wouldn't let me go to OCS. Now, had JNS been anyone else but Johns, I probably would have been in serious trouble as it was. He called me in, and when he realized I wasn't actually responsible for the guy's death, it pretty well ended the matter, but Hartman's body was never recovered, and I kind of blamed myself for his death. I did a lot of soul-searching. Was I just too hard? Maybe my personal feelings unfairly overrode a proper assessment of this guy's worth, on the other hand. If he'd jump into the river over not being appointed to OCS, God only knew how he'd have coped with the stress of being a leader in combat. Still, it bothered me for about a year, until the day I came across an Army intelligence memo that reported a deserter, my old buddy Sergeant Hartman, had been apprehended in America. The story was, he'd never jumped into the river. Instead, he'd caught a merchant ship home from Bremerhaven. Then apparently his mother got so sick of having him around her house that she reported him to the MPS, and they, in turn, threw him into the slammer where he belonged. Colonels Johns and Couch had a thing about company mascots, and after Berlin we all jumped on their spirit-building bandwagon. Coker's B Company got theirs first. A bulldog they aptly named Big Bad John's John Ward's Charlie Cougar Company brought home a huge old alley cat that could fight like its namesake, in keeping with Ward's favourite expression, sustained superior performance, and D Company had to think quick, asked my guys what the deadliest creature on earth was. When they reported back, it was the cobra. I asked what could kill a cobra. The answer was the mongoose, and before long Mongoose Delta Company had. A stuffed mongoose living in the orderly room, its teeth sunk deep in the neck of a full-sized stuffed cobra. It was a real class act. Unfortunately, I barely had a chance to get used to seeing it there, because in early January 1962, Colonel Johns transferred me out of D Company to take over the battle group's combat support company. I hadn't expected another company command. It would be my 8th in the last 10 years, and as exciting as the prospect was, I was somewhat ambivalent about it. I hated leaving my unit, just as ID hated letting go of the Raiders and Fighter Company in Korea, and C Battery, 77th Rye in California. When you work hard and see improvements, when you get to know your troops and watch them grow, you can't remain unattached. Your outfit is not just the best outfit, it's the only outfit, and it becomes hard to imagine your life outside or beyond it. On the other hand, there's not much better in the world than a challenge, and combat support would certainly be that. Since I didn't have much choice in the matter anyway, I chose to look at the bright side, and after turning command of Delta over to recently promoted Captain Ed V, I moved across the company street to start sweeping out my new home. The unit was in good shape when I arrived, with damn capable officers and NCOs. All they needed was a little tightening up. Each platoon had organic vehicles, and the troops had grown accustomed to driving everywhere. They had to be reminded they were infantry foot soldiers, first in combat support a second, but it was easy. Essentially, all I did was walk in, explain my SOPs, most important being the emphasis on basics, and let the guys get on with the work. I brought Robbie Sterling Robinson, my RTO driver, over to combat support with me, and over time managed to grab more studs from D Company to round out the team. I inherited some fine young men with the unit too, most notably Lieutenant John Jack Peppers, the SPAT platoon leader, who reminded me of Eisenhower, the soldier, not the president somehow, and whom I made the mortar platoon leader soon after my arrival, when I realized the captain in charge there was less than adequate for the job. It was a decision I was never to be disappointed with. All too soon, Colonel JNS received orders back to Berlin as Chief of Intelligence. Most of us had known the magic couldn't last forever, but it didn't change the fact that we were incredibly sad to see him go on 15th of January 1962. The battle group fell out smartly for its final review before our favourite soldier. The weather was bitterly cold, but no one noticed. We were all too busy standing tall and greedily soaking in the colonel's farewell address. JNS was a leader who taught by example, so most of the points he made mocks weren't exactly new to us, but to hear in a single speech this great. Man's basic philosophy of soldiering was like being in on the secret ingredients of some magical formula. When Johns had finished, Colonel Couch gave the order to pass in review, and company by company we marched by with just that little extra precision, our shoes, uniforms, and brass earlier attended to provide just that little extra sparkle, as was the custom. The company commanders peeled off after their units passed the reviewing stand and congregated nearby for a final goodbye. Our moment with the colonel was delayed by the 8th Division C.G. Andrew Goodpaster, who had replaced General Dolman in October the minute the last company passed in review. Goodpaster grabbed Johns off the stand and began to chew his arse over something to do with the police of the post. JNS had watched the parade with tears in his eyes. The tears remained as he stood at attention while this prancer, who obviously hadn't heard a word of John's speech, berated him in front of us, totally oblivious to what this day meant to the colonel. Perhaps more couldn't have been expected from this engineer presidential aide to Ike, now managing an infantry division. But we were appalled later. JNS would write to me that Goodpaster's behaviour that day was so incredibly thoughtless that it made him wonder at the man's ability in anything that requires subtle thinking on the other hand. JNS continued. Maybe that's the only thinking he can do, as he damn sure couldn't lead a squad of real soldiers to the PX for a cup of coffee. John's biggest problem, in his own words, was his uncanny ability to alienate my immediate superiors in World War II. He told his regimental Keo he was a stupid son of a gun when John's unit was having the crap kicked out of it, and the CO refused to support him with tanks or artillery to add insult to injury. Then Major JNS next violated the chain of command and personally called the Div Ari commander to organize the firepower he needed in Korea. His attempts to reverse the dangerous apathy that had accompanied the slide into trench warfare put him in constant hot water. My OE for that war was hardly a world-beater either. In Berlin, his stealing the glory from General Dolan and the eth-div staff didn't go down too well at all. In effect, all we got was a kick in the arse for being good, has witnessed that after-action report that had not one kind word for what we did, only grave criticism for the tie-up at the gas point. When I pointed out that an after-action report, the way I understood it, was supposed to enumerate all that was done right and all that was done wrong, and the lessons to be learned as a result, I got a very snotty letter from Goodpaster calling me contumacious. I didn't even know what the word meant, but have about decided that it should be my middle name most of the time when... Dealing with dumb in the rear, Colonel Couch later told me what the farewell ceremony confrontation between Johns and Goodpaster was all about. The problem had actually begun when we first got back from Berlin in our absence. Half our buildings at Coleman Barracks had been given away to a reserve tank battalion, which had been brought over from the US to reinforce the division during the Wall affair. This was clearly unacceptable, and Johns, as senior CE and installation coordinator, had moved everyone around until we got back our fair share of the post. Colonel Gersau, CEO of Heber Post, of which Coleman Barracks was a satellite who commandeered our buildings to begin with, was not impressed next. When Johns and Couch, who before Berlin had daily provided one of the 18th Rifle Companies for the police of the entire post, decided the devil with that, and insisted that all units within the CERN take their turn at police detail. The colonel responsible for housekeeping had gone moaning to Goodpaster. The result was the obscene farewell-ass chewing by the reviewing stand still, despite what had seemed an immediate obscenity to all of us waiting to say goodbye to the colonel. It was nothing compared to the venomous petty faint praise Goodpaster and his ADC Brigadier General William Rosson offered in Colonel Johns's permanent change of station efficiency report, though the colonel was well-groomed, well-grounded, vigorous and self-confident, with an exemplary military appearance, and an unusual ability to inspire officers and men, and to obtain maximum response from his unit, well demonstrated, remarked Goodpaster in one of the understatements of the year, when his battle group was sent into Berlin with no prior notice. JNS also remained aloof from operational detail and close personal supervision on occasion, applied himself less diligently to his role as installation coordinator than desirable, and with some neglect of important details and ancillary or supporting activities in turn assign, Warfare Colonel Couch would later say of Colonel Johns's relationship with certain powerful men, up at Division 1 think they were a little jealous of his capabilities. They didn't like his personality. They couldn't come up to him as a leader and a soldier and think it gall them. Or in Colonel Johns's words, I drove hard and raised hell when I didn't get what I wanted. I made waves. I campaigned about supply procedures. I fought for my men if I thought them unjustly accused by a higher HQ, fought problems too hard from a love of my men as opposed to someone else's men or my own boss's interests, because I had identified too closely with them due to my World War II experiences. I think I saw too many men killed and bled too deeply inside, with the result that I was overprotective. He may well have been, but Colonel J&S translated his love for his men into the one thing that would save them when he was not there to wield the sword himself: good realistic training as PR Tory and high morale, or unabashed cockiness, some might say, within the units in his command. And while guys like Andrew Goodpaster and William Rosson made their way up the glory ladder, gaining 4 stars and the attendant influence, while Lyndon Johnson inherited the presidency and then won it too. It's been said that a long-time family feud, perhaps even a class war between the JNS and Johnson families in Texas, was the only thing that prevented Johns getting his first star on the spot in Berlin. Glover Johns of the non-world, world-beating ER was destined to retire right where he was as a colonel. I hung on, he later wrote me, even though I knew I had no chance for promotion as early as while we were in Berlin. I did so because Hogg found it hard to believe, and because I just plain liked what I was doing. And Glover Johns, in case you didn't know, you made us like it too. I'll call Colonel Johns's DA-issued replacement Gusso. New breed, watch out, fingers ball. New breed did not look like a soldier, short and dumpy, with blue eyes, red blonde hair, heavy jowls, and a rumpled uniform. He always reminded me of a potato sack. He did not act like a soldier either. He was a staff officer, had no infantry combat experience, and was simply not qualified to command a battle group of combat troops. He carried pockets full of candy and handed it out to troopers as he talked to them in the field being any troop position he could reach by jeep and not have to walk instead of endearing the guys to him. This practice only earned him the derisive nickname Candy Bar 6, while JNS could run a unit in the field with his eyes closed. New breed stumbled, bumbled, and screwed up everything he tried, with eyes wide open. As co of Combat Support Company, I worked with him directly on manoeuvres Combat Support Platoon operated separately in the field, as dictated by the tactical situation. New breed would ask things like, where's the INR platoon, which the army had disappeared 5 years before, or where's the 3 Seychelles rupees, 00 radio, which went out not long after Korea, and it wasn't as if it was tough to stay up on the profession if a guy wanted to. There were professional magazines and journals, correspondence courses galore. But I guess this guy bottom line didn't care. His standard response to voiced disappointment and disapproval was "oh balls" in a tone of voice bordering on the effeminate, and when pushed he had temper tantrums that rivaled Colonel Willard's. People started scrambling to get out of the battle. Group, those who remain, talked. Mutiny and feared going into combat with this guy in charge. Don't worry. Said one he wouldn't last a day, and you can bet your sweet ass it ain't going to be enemy who gets him. He was just such an embarrassment. The young officers were disillusioned guys from other battle groups. Jared loud and long at the clubs. The formidable 18th was losing its grip. Thank God for Colonel Couch, we'd think, who stayed on as Deputy Battle Group Kyo under New Breed Couch. Didn't look much like a Prussian soldier either, and certainly not when compared to Johns, who was a casting director's dream, for the perfect military man. Couch was of medium build, and Grant-looking. He wore glasses and always seemed to have a huge cigar hanging out of his mouth, but he knew his trade inside and out, and if he ever felt rusty with the basics, he took personal remedial action. He and his driver used to carry practice grenades in their jeep on the way to the training areas. They'd stop, pick out targets, go prone or kneel behind trees, rocks, or other cover, and throw these dummy grenades. This was pretty exceptional behavior, but perfectly logical to Couch, who explained I'd been sitting on my tail for about 5 years in a staff job. Pitching grenades requires practice. I needed to get back in the groove, and he added it was really a rather closely guarded secret, but old Glover and I would practice with the pistol quite a bit too. Couch had played tough guy to John's benevolent father role the first 6 months I spent with the 18th. I'd been scared to death of him, until I came to understand his subtle sense of humour, and to realise that he too had a heart of gold one time into company on a brutally cold, snowy day. I'd started moving my boys out for a few days' training in the field when Colonel Couch came driving by in his jeep. "Where are you going, Captain?" he'd asked. "Training, sir, in the snow." "Yes, sir, it's on the training schedule. And besides, sir," I added, being a smart-ass, "it does snow in combat, good point. But I want to tell you something, hack to learn. You don't have to suffer. That particular concept had never crossed my mind. I'd always had a Spartan kind of attitude towards soldiering on a personal level anyway, given that one of the first things I tried to do in a new unit was make the garrison lifestyle for everyone as comfortable as possible. When I joined the 18th, I'd gone back to shaving with cold water and sleeping on the ground on manoeuvres, figuring that I might as well get used to it in case we ended up in a battlefield situation. "What are you going to be teaching out there?" Couch asked rifle platoon in the attack and weapons platoon crew. "Drill, sir, fine. Now you just take these boys back to their barracks, talk it with them. They'll love you for it. But don't tell them I said that. Just take them to the front gate, stop the company, call all the lieutenants together and say, 'Gentlemen, do you think it's too cold to train?' They'll all say yes, then you say, 'Well, I think so too,' and take them back. Everybody will think you're a wonderful leader, and you'll get a lot more value out of the thing than you would freezing all your nuts off out in the boonies." Right, Sir. Couch had proved right on all counts. It was a great lesson learned for me, and a morale boost for my near-frozen chosen. How fortunate we would have been had the deputy succeeded Colonel J&S as battle group commander. This was a fairly normal procedure, but Couch himself had bent more than a few noses out of joint, and so was not considered for the job by higher HQ. The reason stated was that the job called for a full colonel and lieutenant at Colonel Couch, had 6 months' time and grade left before promotion. Now the thing of it all was that although Couch was still there to hold the unit together in terms of tactical proficiency, he could not counter the morale bust of the new Kyo, but we take what we could get in only a few months. The 18th would be taking its annual Battle Group Army training test, in which we'd be judged for combat readiness. The ATs, through which careers could be made or broken, were the most important tests in the peacetime army. The 18th had missed the 1961 exercise because of Berlin in 1960 under Colonels Johns and Couch. The 18th had proved itself the best battle group in 7th Army at the best of times. That would be a hard act to follow, add to that new breed, and the fact that we were still pretty rusty from our Berlin stint is parade ground garrison warriors, and Colonel Couch's intensive tactical training was the only hope we had even as the battle group made preparations for its August test smaller scale that were also going on at the company level. Couch designated me chief evaluator for these ATs. It was a challenging, interesting and fun job until B Company's turn came around. Since Dick Coker had been reassigned to Division Bravo, Company had been commanded by a captain I'll call Hale. Hale was loud-affected and incompetent. His troops had his number and hated him for it. My own first serious encounter with him had been during the platoon ATTs, for which he was officer in charge, and I was an observer when an aggressor detail hit the platoon of an old Hawaiian ex-Wolfhound Master Sergeant named Solomon Hale had rushed up to demand Solomon fire his machine guns. "Make some noise," he said to begin, was grossly incompetent. I sent Peppers over to have a look. The class he observed was on mortar fire direction. What he found was that the lieutenant in question was not using the required sharpened pencil to plot his points. Instead, he was teaching his men to use grease pencils. It was like teaching surgeons to perform open-heart surgery with baseball gloves on when translated into a combat situation. These big grease pencil dots on a plotting board could throw the mortar fire off by hundreds of yards, meaning it could easily land not where required but smack dab in the middle of friendly troops manoeuvring underneath. I'd had my share of friendly fire back in Korea, and no way was I going to set this supremely stupid individual free to kill or maim our own boys in the field. After numerous other reports of gross deficiencies on this lieutenant's part, I raised hell until he was relieved. A board upheld our decision to fail Hale's company soon after he left the battle group, and a couple of years later he left the army completely. Colonel Newbreed had been in a state of panic throughout the investigation and had refused to back me up on our initial findings. It really was more than a little tiring to serve under this categorical wimp in his new XO LTC Charles Sniffin, who was married to a senior general's daughter and had been away from troops even longer than old Gus. Luckily, the Sniff, as we all came to call him, I found out later that he nicknamed me Two Sacker after the Hale and Mortar lieutenant affairs was in a staff role, and we were spared his dubious command talents. For a long while, Robbie Robinson was about to go home, so I needed a new RTO driver. I figured that since I'd be spending a lot of time with the new guy, I'd get someone really smart who could fill me in on all the books I hadn't read, which were most besides military stuff, and if he were really articulate, maybe that would rub off on me too. So I went to personnel and asked for a man with a degree in English literature. My ward was a Harvard graduate. I was stoked, and for a couple of weeks we drove down the highway and through the field, this new guy giving me instant courses in things literary, while Sterling having broken the Ivy Leaguer in on the killer Jeep, the radios and our sops hung out in the back seat, waiting to go home one day on manoeuvres. We went up to the top of a hill so I could transmit a couple of radio messages on the way back down. It became quite evident that my new driver was losing control of the vehicle. The old M38 Jeep could negotiate cross-country, driving the latest and greatest M151 could not. The Jeep went into a slide, the driver turned his wheels, and as night follows day, the thing flipped over Robbie. And I were lucky we were thrown out when I'd recovered from that. I looked up on the hillside to see the new driver trapped underneath the overturned vehicle. Gas was pouring out of the Jeep, and the big command radios were throwing sparks. It looked as if we were about to see a pretty spectacular bonfire. Robbie and I ran up the hill. The driver's legs were pinned under the Jeep. I picked up the back end of the thing and with Robbie slid the guy out, pretty staggering, what a human being can do under stress. When the adrenaline starts pumping, I tried to lift the back end of that Jeep again when the emergency was over and couldn't budge it an inch. I looked at the boy and knew he was gone. He wore that ash and death look I'd seen too many times. I started up all the old battlefield stuff you're doing. Great, kid. You're going to make it, while I watched him check out of the net. Then he started praying. I thought it was Hebrew, but I didn't know. The main thing was he knew I was bullshitting him, and he was going to die at the same moment. I heard an army helicopter flying overhead. Maybe God was listening miraculously. I got the pilot on the radio without even knowing his frequency. When I popped a smoke, he came down and whisked the kid off to the hospital. The long and short of it was the boy didn't die. His pubic bone had been broken in the accident and had become like two razor blades cutting his insides apart. He had massive internal injuries and ended up pretty badly crippled for a few years, but ultimately got on his feet again. Still, the bottom line of the incident was that it shouldn't have happened. All this boy's pain was due to a new-fangled army-issued piece of junk, which had everything and could do anything except get you from point A to point B in safety. I called it Wonder Gear. All the Army's experiments that made it past the prototype phase and into the hands of human guinea pig troopers. Much in general terms was useless, some incredibly dangerous in combat support. I had the opportunity to see a hell of a lot of both. The Spat, for instance, was a 90M anti-tank gun sitting on a full track chassis. The concept was great. It was modelled after the German 88, which darted in and out of the action and RRE havoc all over European battlefields in World War II. But the American version had a gun too heavy for its base spare parts unavailable through the normal requisition system. The weapon had actually become obsolete during its short life and was being phased out for the SS-10 and SS-11 anti-tank missiles, and a weak track system that almost invariably had us towing the things back from manoeuvres. If they were beached whales, another bit of wonder gear, the brand new M113 APC was a totally unnecessary vehicle and a first-class disaster waiting in to happen to begin with. Infantry didn't and don't need armoured personnel carriers. In fact, the last thing an army should want is foot soldiers dependent on vehicles. The tried-and-true method for carrying infantry squads into battle was to have them ride piggyback on the backs of tanks. If the spearhead of my company had been in APCs on 6th of February 1951, every single one of us would have been dead if an APC hit a mine. You'd lose a squad. As it was by default, you invariably lost one or more effective members of an 11-man squad just to the driving and maintenance of the vehicle. And then there was the M113's basic design, which was so miserable that you'd almost believe all America's enemies had joined together to have it built. The thing looked like a huge shoebox on the battlefield, an irresistible high-profile target. But the worst thing about the new APC, which we and the Army didn't know in 1962 but would soon find out, at great cost in lives, was that the M113 was also a crematorium on tracks. The M113 APC was made of a highly flammable magnesium alloy in the next war, based on the vehicle's Fury track record from its earliest sparks of battle. Drivers would reach the point where they'd refuse to get inside it. Instead, they'd sit on the heavily sandbagged top and control the thing with wires they'd attach to the steering column and gears below, still among the many wonder weapons available at this time. The greatest of them all was the atomic MC cannon, the Darve Crockett, as early as 1956. This sub-kiloton frontline tactical nuclear weapon was in production, but only now was it being issued at the troop-level combat support company. 18th Infantry was to be the first unit in the European theatre tested for operational readiness. In its use, Gusso called me on the phone. Our careers hinged, or so he said, on getting a Davy Crockett platoon together that would pass a technical efficiency inspection TPI in about 3 months' time. This was very serious stuff. I had my pick of any men in the battle group for platoon leader and other personnel. The first thing I did was grab Tim Grattan out of D Company and make him CEO. We got top priority for replacements. Tim picked about 15 top stud troops for his command from the new guys, or through stealing the best from other companies, according to New Breed. The only off-limits man in the entire battle group was the colonel's own driver. We were issued a fine old combat paratrooper NCO named Bolts, who'd been trained at Benning on the Davy Crockett, and would be. Our resident expert on the system, Tim, and he organised firing teams and began to train day and night. They used dummy warheads, large watermelon-shaped projectiles that fit onto a rocket launcher mounted on a jeep or tripod. It was designed to throw the thing out there far enough to use the warhead without hurting us, Tim would say later. But I don't think the system ever could have worked correctly. It didn't seem likely for a number of reasons, just one being the SOP for permission to fire. It went like this. The section leader who first saw Soviet tanks roaring over the West German hills would ask Tim for permission to fire. Tim would then call and ask me. I would ask New Breed. New Breed would call Goodpaster at division, who would then call the Corps CG, who'd call the 7th Army CG, who'd call the NATO CG, who'd call the Pentagon, who call the President, who'd make his decision and send it back down the chain of command by the time the unit got the green light some 2.5 hours later, and coordinated with nearby units to make sure their guys knew not to look at the fireball. The Soviet tanks originally sighted by the gunner would be in Paris, on the other hand, as Field Marshal Montgomery had said regarding atomic weaponry, that he'd fire first and ask questions later. It was kind of hard to envision a nervous corporal while watching Soviet tanks barrel into his position, waiting patiently for permission to nuke them. The key thing about the Davy Crockett, said Tim, is that the weapon system itself was designed by a bunch of intellectual pinheads who'd never seen a battlefield, and if they thought that young troops on the battlefield could throw one of these nuke devices out about 3,000 mers and not have the effects of the nuclear blast on themselves or their own unit, they were crazy. Nonetheless, the training went on, the TPI took place, and Tim and Bolts passed it with flying colours. Tim was the only man in the theatre ever to fire a live Darve Crockett heat training round. The only problem left then was where the unit would get live atomic warheads if it needed them. Even Tim, as platoon leader, did not know where they were kept or an SOP for procuring them in an emergency, curiously found out many years later from a man who helped develop the Davy Crockett, who was not an intellectual pinhead and had in fact spent many years on battlefield, which to me made the weapon uselessness even more unfathomable, that live warheads could have been procured within about 2 hours. It was good, if not somewhat belated news. The Russians would still have gotten to Paris, but maybe we would have been able to stop them before they started to mix vodka with Dom Perino.